I'm Stephen McLean, and in this presentation, we'll touch upon three methods of research and the application to the study of sexual violence mitigation. Recent media exposure and increasing empowerment by survivors has brought the problem of sexual violence on college campuses to the forefront of the post-secondary environment. In greater society, various socioeconomic factors result in incidents of sexual violence committed against either gender as a significantly underreported crime. Post-secondary educational institutions, particularly those in British Columbia, struggle with how to deal with incidents of sexual violence in such a manner that the provincial government has mandated that each public institution in the province develop a policy to address sexual violence. Knowing that post-secondary educational institutions' response to sexual violence is not standardized and may not meet the needs of the survivor of sexual violence, nor that there is no standardized approach across institutions to mitigate sexual violence, my research question asks if sexual violence can be defined as a disaster, and as such, will the four pillars of disaster and emergency management be effective in mitigating incidents of sexual violence within the college and university societal context? This qualitative study will address the gaps and inconsistencies in sexual violence mitigation measures and responses at college and university campuses, and the impact these challenges have on survivors of sexual violence and support workers. The aim of this study is to apply the definition of disaster to sexual violence and mitigate incidents of sexual violence on campuses through the application of the four pillars of disaster and emergency management. This presentation will touch upon three methods of qualitative research, those methods being grounded theory, narrative research, and phenomenological research. Grounded theory is a process utilized by a researcher to develop a theory grounded in the observations of human subjects involved in the study. For the purposes of my research, the story survivors of sexual violence and those practitioners who provide support to them are key elements in supporting my theory that sexual violence meets the criteria to be defined as a disaster, and that the pillars of disaster and emergency management will apply to mitigate sexual violence on campus. Chioviti and Perrin employed grounded theory in a study as a means to develop rigor in their research process related to clinical nursing practices. Rigor in research is subject to standards, which includes credibility, but also fittingness and auditability of the research. My research is intended to develop real solutions to real problems, and as these findings may directly impact people and perhaps the social justice process, rigor in my research is critical. Corbin and Strauss indicate that a researcher working in grounded theory should feel empowered to test their concepts with colleagues knowledgeable in the research subject, and that they should be open to scrutiny. To ensure my research stands up to the rigor test, I will welcome constructive criticism of my research to ensure I develop a credible product. My research must be transferable from theory to practice. Narrative research is a method whereby a human subject tells a researcher their personal story and experiences. The researcher then retells the story in a chronological order to support the data of the study. My research is founded on the human story as it is a human problem. The stories of survivors are important to developing mitigating strategies against sexual violence on campus. However, due to the sensitive nature of the subject and the potentially triggering aspects of survivors recounting the events, I must carefully determine how much of the story should be told, at what point the story should start, and most importantly, that the elements of the story told is pertinent to the research. Narrative research techniques include descriptive and explanatory. The descriptive technique demonstrates a host of elements, including the intersection of an event experienced by a subject, the conditions contributing to the event, and the impact the event had on the subject's life course. The explanatory technique involves the researcher accounting through the narrative as to why something has happened. For the purposes of my research, I feel that I will incorporate components of the two techniques. However, I must be cognizant of the sensitivities of the stories. One story at a time must be told through the narrative research method, and each story should be accepted as individual data. Narrative research is prone to validity issues. One concern outlined by Polkinghorne is that the context in which a person tells their story to the researcher and then how the researcher interprets the story can conflict and not be a true reflection of the narrative data. To counter these threats of validity, the researcher should adopt an open listening mindset and let the subject tell their story rather than having a closed, purely fact gathering mindset. This is absolutely germane to the narrative research I'll be conducting with survivors and supporters. The phenomenology research method tells the stories of many participants of a study as those stories pertain to the problem or the phenomenon. The issue of sexual violence on campuses affects many people from survivors to support workers, their families, the perpetrator, and the campus community as a whole. The experiences of the study group are the primary focus of my research to allow me to obtain evidence to support my theory that the pillars of disaster and emergency management can be applied to mitigate sexual violence.